Hello everyone, today we talk about Arduin of Ivrea, born around 955, the same year of the Battle of Lechfeld. You want to appreciate so the times, the context is always important. In the locality of Pombia, within the Novarese region in northwestern Italy, today's Piedmont. At the time it was technically conceived as Lombardy, because historical Lombardy was sort of more stretching for the obvious reason that the Italic kingdom had historically been Langobardia, the kingdom of the Longobards, and did not know some of the later sort of feudal but also communal frontiers that were yet to form in this period. Arduin emerged as a prominent figure from a noble family of Frankish Burgundian extraction, essentially rooted in Italy from Carolingian times, closely affiliated with the Anscarid one, also known as the House of Ivrea, which originated also from Burgundian Frankish roots, naturally intermarried with the local Longobard nobility as well, and that had been established, in fact, in the north part of the peninsula, in the Po Valley, if you want to sort of geographically separate the two things, since the late 9th century. In fact, we are probably in the later Carolingian times, when Ansgar the first was appointed Margrave of Ivrea, so a frontier duke essentially, by Carolingian authorities to defend against Magyar incursions that at the time, as you know, were hitting hard, mostly the Eastern Frankish kingdom, but also the Western and the Italic one. I made some videos about the Battle of Reade. We'll have to make Lechfeld, we just mentioned, but we began looking at sort of very interesting aspects of the later continuity of the German, also actually the Italian interference, Hungarian affairs, that really reminds of the earlier clashes between these peoples, albeit in sort of very different time, known as one of the second invasions, at least where I come from, historiographically speaking. And the Anscarids gained considerable influence in the region over the course of the 10th century, as most of, in fact, the higher nobility, or at least the one that rose to that level, as a consequence of the disgregation of post-Carolingian Europe. Right? I made so many videos, especially in the early years of Schwerpunkt. We're going to continue this, explaining this period in history. Is probably one of the single most underrated ones in the High Middle Ages, after the collapse of at least the unity of the Carolingian Empire, because technically Carolingians kept ruling for a while in West Francia, and essentially a new era that can be the Crusade one, if you want, in this case also for Italy, witnessing to the start of the communes, and so bringing a bit to an end, especially in this region, to the traditional hegemony of the feudal aristocracy. Actually, the same communal one, the consular regime, was made up of the same knights coming from the countryside, and very powerful families, especially in the north of the peninsula. As we'll see now, I haven't made videos on the Anscarids, that, if you have never heard of, are actually one of the most powerful and important families in Europe during, in fact, these centuries. Had control over some of the major centers in the Po Valley. And what you see here as per title is fundamentally the capacity of this local establishment to champion a ruler that could oppose himself to the, by this time, as you understand, also relatively recent, but still sort of strong affirmation of the Eastern Frankish kings as de facto the ones securing the imperial election in a non-hereditary, because that will remain, in fact, an elective mechanism, but that had excluded and tried to curb in particular the Italic nobility, right? That was actually very powerful in the same ways we just described, and also because of the policy of bishop counts that, while tending to essentially confer more powerful to the ecclesiastical, to the diocese of the great urban centers of the peninsula that were, in fact, unlike north of the Alps, mostly like the true central pivots of power, the latter were still run by bishops that belonged to these families. And so it was always to the slave families vying for kingly and imperial power. There is all a mechanism, by the way, that pertains to the various chunks of the post-Carolingian kingdoms that is very interesting to look at in some detail. For Italy, we made a video once about the resistance to Hugh of Provence. We talked about Duchy of Spoleto, the affirmation of the great ecclesiastical principalities, also further co-opted by the Ottonians. We talked a lot about Ottonian Italy as well. Well, you have to imagine these houses having remained all along as vassals, or largely because they truly and really belonged to, as you understand here, very ancient noble lineages coming often, again, from France, from northern France in particular, the area of Neustria, essentially, the core of Carolingian power, because Carolingians had installed the finest noblemen in Italy, right? This was essentially the most important place for the empire to risk, even to begin with. And so they sent some of the most powerful lineages that remained there. For example, the later Welfen in Germany actually were of the same origin, coming from Italy, from Este. And those were a bit like the Anscarids, originary of the Frankish world, and eventually through an imperial political dimension that actually had tied, especially by that point, the Italic and the Eastern Frankish kingdom, for the obvious reasons that you all know, from the Ottonians onwards, witness to an incredibly fluid, sort of permeable political interaction between the north and the south of the Alps. Right, in directly participatory way. I mean, when German diets were held, especially in these early days, were lots of Italic noblemen that actually participated, really moved from south of the Alps, interacting in this bigger policy. Also consider that these higher, sort of after the Carolingian Empire, like the imperial blood had been shared largely. These houses were all intermarried. They had, as elite, probably a higher and wider connection between one another. Admittedly, the fragmentation of the same empire had brought to a great deal of dispersion and, in fact, a further rise in entrenchment, if anything, of these groups in the various parts. Italy was peculiar because not just already from the time of Louis the Pious, basically was consensually established that there was no way to have an empire without the crowning in Rome and consequently of the Italic crown. But in this sense, you literally had to march into Italy from the north, from one side, and that you would have instead probably Italic rulers next door, like the same Ivrea or Friuli or Spoleto in the Tuscany, etc., that would try to vie for the same imperial crown. And as kings of Italy at the same time, because you could not be even as an Italic ruler, an emperor without having priorly recognized as an Italic king, which was also sort of a formal process, but it did entail the crowning in the historical sees of Pavia, of Milan, or Monza, whatever, being properly bestowed the Iron Crown. You understand how sort of threatening this situation was, especially for the Eastern Frankish king. The Ottonian period sees practically unchallenged power until, in fact, the crisis followed to the death of Otto III, and now we will see immediately, like, if you know the story, it's easy, right, with Henry II, etc. But that's the moment in this vacuum of power that will become all too typical of later Italian royal history, because of the absence, in fact, of German rulers that at some point could descend into the peninsula, but they had, in any case, to come back to Germany. Some tried, let's say, the same Otto III to rule from Rome. He was ousted. Later, the Hohenstaufen will do that from Sicily or Apulia, if anything. Always trying to take direct and permanent control of Rome, and how dangerous it was for them when, in fact, some powerful feudal nobility in the Italic kingdom could simply say, well, but we can become Italic kings ourselves. I mean, back in the day, there had been properly emperors. Like the titling is often like not counted, at least in a bigger sense, because they weren't even like any other ruler in post-Carolingian Europe at the time capable of properly being an emperor. But back in the day, for example, Charles the Bald had been a Western Frankish emperor. You know all the story. I don't have to tell you more than that, but for telling you how delicate the game was, and how, if you think about it in hindsight, the wars of the Lombard League and the final victory of the Italian communes over a direct, sort of, at least an attemptably direct and centralized rule of the German emperor in the peninsula, would really show how much potential existed there in a time in which the country was still de facto ruled by a feudal establishment. All right, so the transition from these two periods is quite delicate. If anything, you can observe it in some series that it made, for example, last year, mostly about Florence, that with Matilda of Canossa, the entire issue of her legacy, but also the interplay with the early Florentine commune, shows you how non-obvious this story is, and how important, by the way, these lands really are. All right. Now, Arduin's father, Dado, held the county of Pombia, and scholarly debate persists regarding whether Dado was a nephew of King Berengar II, with some proposing Ascarius II as the linking brother and others favoring Amadeus I. The choice of Arduin's name deliberately honored his maternal grandfather, Arduin Glaber, also known as Arduin III Glabrio or Arduin the Bald, in fact, who had served as an early count and margrave of Turin from a collateral noble branch. Arduin entered into marriage with Bertha, identified with high probability as a daughter of Otbert II, leading margrave of the Obertenghi lineage, a powerful northern Italian noble family of Longbird origin that rose to prominence in the 10th century, controlling extensive territories including parts of eastern Liguria, Milan, Genoa. The last two cities were historically deeply entwined because they shared broader metropolitic repartition since late antiquity, and essentially Genoa was, you can say, the port of Milan, but it was sort of the closest outlet just across the Apennine in the south for the essentially what was rising as the largest city in Europe. Tortona and Luni. It shows you this Piedmontese, but also Ligurian and even Tuscan. Luni is located in on the Tyrrhenian watershed, and it connects basically Liguria with Tuscany. And as you've seen, the Mark of Tuscany had been quite involved in all. If anything, there was the Roman road from France that already at that point had been used by the Provençals, by the Burgundians, by anyone that from the west wanted to enter Italy. The Obertenghi had obtained all of this through imperial appointments, strategic expansions. You understand how powerful in scale they were, really. They were essentially extending to almost a regional power. This will become the patrimonial basis, as we'll see now, for the same Arduin, largely to affirm probably an Italic rule centered on the western Po Valley. Now, this matrimonial alliance, again, between Arduin and Bertha, produced three sons. The eldest, named Arduin, sometimes designated as Ardicinus, followed by Otto and Wibert. These offspring established the enduring comital dynasties associated with Ivrea, diverging to the lines of Castellamonte, Allier, Brosso, Rivarolo in front, whereas a sibling of Arduin named Wibert initiated the counts of Pombia, subsequently extended to Biandrate, San Martino, Valperga, and Masino. These are all, again, localities. If you want to really check the map, you can find, but say you have to understand them as part of this typically post-Carolingian seigneurial spread with a political geography that is very different and very difficultly reconstructible, especially even just in a cartographic sense, as you know, for the High Middle Ages. These families were absolutely habituated, just like also the Frankish one, and sort of in across all post-Carolingian Europe, to have vast estates scattered across an equally vast domain, in that their power was mostly based, of course, in the capacity of aggregating enough force to exercise rule here and there, and otherwise, so passing over like an otherwise labyrinthic set of sort of property, depending on what we're looking at. Again, dioceses with ecclesiastical exemptions, immunities, and sort of other feudal territories like public ones, etc. Now, the comital jurisdiction of Pombia, for example, extended across the upper and middle sections of the Nova Race, incorporating the urban center of Navarre itself. Around 990, Arduin inherited the governance of the Mark of Ivrea. That was essentially the westernmost, like Italic mark, quite strategically controlling the Alpine passes from the Po Valley towards the Burgundy fundamentally, but in a broader sense, Gaul to France. From his relative Conrad Conus, the third son of Berengar II, again, Italic king, like fully also independent Italic king back in the day, who had married another daughter of Arduin Glaber, with the succession occurring either through direct imperial nomination by Otto III or via adoption facilitated by their twofold kingship relations. And of course, all these individuals were in contact with the imperial court, whether in Italy or in Germany. Everybody knew what was going on internationally across all this immense territory, as these were the key houses controlling Western Europe. Now, following Berengar II's territorial adjustments around 950, the Mark of Ivrea encompassed the counties of Ivrea that, in fact, had sort of, we also historiographically just called them like this then, but they were called also properly like the Mark of Ivrea, for example, but there were also different titles depending on how they would conceptualize the thing, given that they were mostly an agglomeration of other seigneuries. In fact, they owned the county, also Vercelli of Pombia, Ossola, Stazzona, Bulgaria, and Lomello, corresponding approximately to the ecclesiastical dioceses of Ivrea, Vercelli, Novara, and Vigevano, in addition to portions of the dioceses of Pavia, so nominally the Italic capital itself, and potentially even the one of Milan. So the power is insane. What we will realize now is that basically the actual true direct center of power, say, and control that the Markians of Ivrea had revolved around essentially the western center Po Valley, that at the time, also together with northern France, this will remain for a very long time, even today, one of the most, actually the most advanced parts of Western Europe, right? So we are looking at really enormous amount of wealth, thickly fortified and entwined urban centers with literate elites, strong episcopal chapters, administrative bodies, strong also in that sense vassalitic, probably military retinues, both in the lay and ecclesiastical world, lots of monetary exchange for considering European standards. So a very growing, like in a century, basically the communes will emerge as de facto independent polities, because they were literally created by themselves. In 991, Arduin further acquired the prestigious office of Count of the Sacred Palace of the Lateran in Rome. Just other little title that shows you how sort of imperially minded this dynasty was, and hence, in fact, Arduin's standing within the Italian, but also in that sense, probably ecumenic political landscape, right? This guy was understood from this northwestern Italian base of power as the guy who could fundamentally defend Rome, that had as we'll see now, managed to seize the Italic crown, and it could go at war with the same emperor, right? In his capacity as Margrave of Ivrea, Arduin consistently pursued policies that upheld monastic privileges and safeguarded the position of lesser nobility, most notably the class known as the Secondi Milites, who maintained rural fiefs increasingly imperiled by the encroaching authority of bishops supported by the Ottonian emperors. This is paradoxical because, for example, in 1037, it's not that far away, Conrad II, the Salian, who needed, in fact, the backbone of, in fact, the Italic military, will issue the Constitutio de Feudis that sanctioned the inheritability, the legal inheritability of the minor fiefs, right? That, as it seemed, that already at that point, like the bigger ones in Italy were a bit discontent, also because of what had happened to Arduin, as we'll see now. So it's quite fascinating dynamics. In other words, Arduin was, of course, competing with other Italic noblemen, and he protected his own clienteles, but also signaled essentially to all these lesser milites that considered, again, the numerical bulk of the Italic army, that he was ready to sort of provide them with enough autonomy from the rising higher noblemen, which is normally what a king does, right? That sort of counters the nobility by also making leverage on the lower strata. In this case, this was the same aristocracy. This programmatic orientation necessarily engendered profound antagonisms, for Arduin endeavored to reinstate the comprehensive political, economic, and legal authority of the same Monarch of Ivrea in direct opposition to imperial strategies aimed at augmenting episcopal dominance within civic boundaries and over church estates. Right? So he was seeing it right. He was to be the next king of Italy, and as such, to basically control from a much more direct position the episcopal establishment that the Ottonians had endowed with enormous public authority. In fact, as you know, these Italian bishops were known as bishop counts, as they had thought, and successfully so, because this phenomenon was very pronounced, as we hinted at before, that since the bishop could not personally own the comitatus, that is essentially the county, so the basic nucleus of the local city plus diocese and so on, that in particular in Italy and in all these Po Valley sort of very robustly rising urban centers could also prevent properly the passage right across the Po Valley, the Alps, the Apennines of the emperor to go to Rome. In fact, power that could not be inherited, could not be split, because they were just bishops, differently from the lay nobility. So as we've seen it, also in recent videos, we made it, for example, the one about Fulknera, that is more or less contemporary to the events, right? There, like in France, everything is pure, the pure explosion of private lay aristocracy, right? The Italic kingdom had historically been much more and better statally structured, and this sense being also more sort of polycentric, but still on this sort of more uniformly identifiable system. And the reason why the Ottonians had done this in Italy is not much that they wanted to give bishops per se individually so much power, but it was much better than the lay nobility. Like, they could simply seize those cities for their own in an increasingly private and dynastic fashion. And in any case, again, the Germans, more often than not, ruled only from north of the Alps, and it was better to have these bishops rather than the lay nobility to take over. That would try to do. Of course, if you are instead one of those lay noblemen emerging as king of Italy, you have a completely different attitude, both towards the emperor and the episcopate that also controls, let's stress this, exactly also because of those privileges and comital powers, great part of also the local aristocracy that, in any case, produces these bishops at the same time. You understand how intricate but logic this whole thing really is. Now, the base of Arduin's support drew, in fact, from various disgruntled elements, including that same clergy alienated from the prevailing order. So also the one of minor ecclesiastical centers, dioceses, that just like those secondi milites were a bit like the secondi priests in this regard. And this is exemplified by, for example, Gisalbert, the archdeacon of Vercelli in Piedmont, himself a former serf of the church who had prospered immensely through exploitation of ecclesiastical resources, accompanied by relatives that included a judicial figure and escaped serfs, as well as the archpriest Cunibert, complemented by segments of the urban population of the same Ivrea, and numerous dependents who had previously capitalized on the lax administration under bishops known for concubinage or who now desired relief from oppressive burdens. If you're interested in general, there is all the phase of the Pateria that I made lots of videos on. It's sort of slightly later, but all those instances of ecclesiastical reform were arising at this point with Cluny. It was already there. So the religious policy was very important as well, because in theory Arduin belonged exactly to that group of laymen that supported at this point a smaller control of probably the church in general, of the same ecclesiastical policy. We are before the Gregorian reforms. At this point, as we'll see now, Sylvester the second, Schwerpunkt of Ivrea, will rise to confer the Church of Rome a truly sort of achievable universal power, even in terms probably of ecclesiastical policy of administrative control across Europe. But it's all in theory. You don't know. This is interesting about this period, and that's why also Arduin is a sort of key figure here, because everything could relatively change, at least in ways we will never know exactly how. But there was so much at stake, right? So much on the table. Now, the inaugural significant confrontation unfolded between 996 and 997 involving Peter, the bishop of Vercelli, an appointee favored by the Ottonians, who had recently returned from captivity among Muslims in Egypt, because the Saracens are still around. Admittedly, now the Italian maritime republics are taking over. There are still nests scattered, especially in southern France. We're not talking about Spain, that are particularly annoying, harassing, at least probably the coastal frontier of Italy, so to say, but they had already been soundly beaten, especially since the time of the Garigliano battle. That's something belongs a bit to previous generation. At this point, probably Europe has already taken off for good, right? And so at this point, it's all about rules. And so this guy, how did he fall in, by the way, in the hands of the Muslims? Well, at the Imperial defeat at Stilo in 982 under Otto II. This was a disaster, a bloodbath of German lay and ecclesiastical leaders in Calabria at the hands of the Muslims of Sicily. We've seen that the same Otto II barely escaped from there, so because it was actually captured, sort of kidnapped by the Byzantines, and in theory were his friends, but you know how these things really go. I made an entire video about Otto II's military history, so if you're interested in the context in the immediate years, here you understand Arduin was in his 20s when that happened. So imagine, again, having lived across all these events that we conceptually parcelized, sort of not overlap, but these were the men that had been ruling the Italic kingdom throughout all these pretty troubled times. And this bishop had actively engaged in rehabilitating his diocese's dissipated patrimony inherited from predecessors such as the notorious concubinus Ingo. The core of the contention revolved around the court of Caresana, initially bestowed by Conrad Conus in 987 upon the canons of St. Eusebius in Vercelli, yet rendered legally precarious by Otto I's prior seizures from Berengar II's holdings subsequently granted to his consort. Empress Adelaide thus reaffirmed the donation in Frankfurt am Main during November 995, with the pertinent charter exhibited at the Placitum in Pavia in the following April. So they had literally issued this order, and they had made it public in the Italic kingdom, so that was law. And Margrave Hugh of Tuscia replicated the grant at Sale in September 996 to solidify title, right? And all this, again, because all these provinces of Italy were basically at each other's throats to prevent, essentially, each other to take over the Italic royal title. In the opening months of 997, with chronological details fluctuating between a traditional feast date of February the 13th and necrological entries of March the 17th, adherents of Arduin launched an assault on Vercelli, resulting in Peter's slaying. You understand, this is heavy stuff, and that's how much, this even idea of imperial rule, of actual imperial rule, because that's what this rebellion was about, right? Demonstrating that the Italics, the Longobards, were stronger than the Saxons, right? That they had more divine right to rule as Holy Roman emperors than the Germans, right? And they kill this priest. And this is a very strongly Ghibelline mentality, ante litteram, meaning truly like the idea that there is an usurpation of public authority, imperial rule by the priesthood. This is something that these men, as we've seen, they were all knights, quite properly imbued with that sense of the cingulum militaris means that I'm sacred. I'm a sacred militia. I'm of noble blood, etc. This can't happen. They want a more feudal course of events. They don't like this sort of city-based policy, especially at least that the Ottonians have enforced, because they want to control cities by themselves. So they kill the bishop, interestingly enough. And you've seen before how delicate the thing is, right? Because here the Margrave of Ivrea is recognized also in Rome as a potential protector of the Holy See that is starting to try to be a bit more autonomous from the empire. And in between, literally have Tuscany, and the House of Ivrea has possessions that can allow them to enter the same territory. It's a big deal, all right? As you can imagine, also the slaying of the bishop was a great deal. And so the ensuing conflagration engulfed the cathedral, incinerating his corpse as well. That was purified, annihilated actually by sacred fire, though official imperial documents clearly delineated Arduin's responsibility for directing the incursion from the actual execution of the homicide and subsequent desecration, even as detractors in correspondence to Gregory V in 998, so to portray such corpse burning as a customary practice of some sort. Now, concurrently, comparable aggressions were directed against Varmund, Bishop of Ivrea, likewise an Ottonian protege diligently reclaiming vassals and diocesan properties in order to weaken margravial rule on behalf of the emperor. Arduin, frequently assisted by his brother Amadeus and on occasion by Everard, undertook multiple violent expulsions of Varmund from his episcopal seat and systematic ravaging of ecclesiastical domains, bolstered by the complicity or inaction of direct vassals attached to the Church of Santa Maria, who either preferred active counsel or failed to fulfill defensive obligations, alongside alliances with factions of Ivrea's citizenry. If you're interested, I will post it in the top fixed comment down below. I made a video about urban power before communes, how were properly the Italian cities organized before the communal era. And so even way before they were emerging as fully fledged city-states, they were pretty well organized. But we'll talk about this also, something about the Longobards army, because this was something going on from ever. Like, these communities had a very strong sense of themselves, that municipal pride stemming directly from late antiquity without fracture, because in Southern Europe, and especially in Italy, urban life continued directly also in a sense of political identity straight from antiquity. Now, in contrast to the Vercelli episode, where church serfs predominantly appeared as sufferers, the dynamics in Ivrea initially manifested as augmented exploitation of subordinated estates coincident with incipient movements towards emancipation, propelled by the aspirations of lesser knights, right? Varmund responded with reiterated admonitions prior to invoking solemn excommunications enacted ceremonially by 12 priests, clutching illuminated candles with the pronouncement disseminated publicly within the cathedral through straightforward explication, and then propagated across individual parishes on the ensuing Sunday to encompass the extensive network of Arduin's sympathizers dispersed through the diocese. Such ecclesiastical condemnations yielded no tangible results. Toward the close of 998, presumably the collective bishops of the Mark addressed Gregory V shortly after his restoration in Rome that February, because Rome had all her issues on her own, decrying Arduin's utter deficiency in divine or human attributes and expressing disillusionment over the emperor's reluctance to intervene decisively, right? This is quite fascinating because it shows actually imperial weakness from one side. In fact, the Pope was kind of basically, if not openly backing Arduin, but sort of trying to exploit the situation and his own advantage. The pontiff, in fact, replied himself with stern rebukes, branding Arduin as an aggressor against the Christian faith, yet confined his response to exhortations for repentance, deferring any ultimate sanction until the approaching Easter, right? So the Pope, that was also a clever position. Like, you show that, you can't do that. Like, it's illegal in any case, but we can't even just do too much. And apparently, as we've seen, this guy protects the Saint Lateran in arms. And the situation is pretty troubled in Italy, as Roman affairs have just showed themselves to create such a powerful enemy, the more powerful ruler in Italy in the moment. Now, the imperial disposition shifted markedly with the promulgation of the Pavia Capitularies in September 998, conceivably composed by the influential Logothete Leo, scornfully nicknamed the Palace Bishop, which invalidated all church land concessions, not explicitly lifelong, and resolutely prohibited the manumission of serfs, particularly those bound to ecclesiastical institutions, thereby striking directly at the vested interests Arduin had protected. All right, this is so deep, not just because, as you've seen here, the church wants to amass this enormous power and living off of essentially imperial protection in this, but Arduin had wanted probably to emancipate serfs, at least to the degree historically these people had fallen under ecclesiastical lordship. I made an entire video again explaining how this had happened in the century before, this massive expansion of ecclesiastical possessions during the Carolingian era. And Arduin instead saw in the emancipation, in the redemption of these individuals, like a potential for also an actual armored force of auxiliary infantry that, as we've seen in a video about the 11th century Milanese army buildup, kind of give you an idea, as peditas, as infantrymen, how strong this infantry was, how much manpower and quality of it Italy had in potential, given the per capita wealth, also the defense of this massively fortified cities, etc., that the emperor and the church had tried not to back, right? So Arduin wanted really to unhinge the cornerstones of imperial ecclesiastical control over Italy through a essentially free knighthood and some emancipated rustics. Interestingly enough, the fact that in Pavia there is this guy working for the emperor that has a title that is probably motivated from the older Byzantine tradition, also for different reasons that are not so evident. But again, the Ottonians had married into, as you know, at least broadly, the Byzantine world, because it's not like Teofano was born in the purple, so to say. And so they had maintained a bit this, you see, in the Italic kingdom, there were essentially Longobard titles. There weren't Byzantine ones. So this guy also had a Roman name. All these other guys from Arduin's side, you understand, they had Germanic names. Right? It's a bit like Liutprand of Cremona. This intended themselves as Germans, even though they were Romans, really, because they were truly Longobards and habituated to be free. The case of Arduin is different because in any case, this elite was of sort of straightforward Germanic ancestry in particular, but they still, of course, bonded with a truly Italic Longobardic, if you prefer. Still, even the Carolingians had done much to properly change the name of the country so that it didn't sound too like the one of the old Lombards, but that's how actually everybody out there called the Italians at this point, the Arabs, the Germans. Italy was Lombardy. And so there is something deep here, even in terms properly of national resurgence in national pride and real will to power. If you watch my video about medieval Cremona, for example, you realize how a few decades later, Zanen della Balla, that's means in Lombard dialect John of the Bowl, literally rose against the emperor as a knight, as a Cremonese knight, a Lombard knight that said, basically this globe, the golden globe that had to be given by Cremona, this tells also how rich these cities were, as a tribute to the emperor, he stripped from imperial delegates and gave it to his fiancée. So we're talking also a strongly knightly tradition that we tend to sort of put aside a little bit, or to conceptualize also mostly for later times, that I also discussed in videos about, for example, the Carolingian and Saxon dubbing ceremonies and meanings, etc. It was incredibly alive. Nobody covers this period in history. Nobody emphasizes how intensely these beliefs were lived. Right? Arduin was exactly an incarnation of it. Right? Besides, Leo's burgeoning influence, consummated in his appointment as Bishop of Vercelli by May 999, exemplified the Ottonian preference for relying upon prelates to govern the western frontier marches, where traditional lay administrative structures retain greater resilience. This is also another important aspect of the struggle, because this is an area that will remain also in later times during a communal era, more feudal in nature. I haven't made perhaps so many videos about, well, yeah, I did. If you actually dig my playlist, instead of being passively fed by the dreadful YouTube algorithm, you will find even abundant material in this. But it's important to look a bit at the political geography of Italy as well, because Piedmont historically was sort of less urbanized than Lombardy, for example. And here, of course, there is nothing deterministic, but obviously the emperor, even when he was not in Italy, normally tried to push out, like to the French, those elements that were, however, mostly had remained in the French, like especially in a country like Italy where cities were so important. So places like Lombardy, Tuscany in general, were exhibiting already more and better sort of traits of civilized development and so on. Like the entire feudal hierarchy of these lands contemplated that these centers were to be ruled by some, in fact, imperial public, but in this sense also delegated feudal authority. We explained it before with the bishop counts. During the spring of 999, a synod assembled in Rome under the auspices of Otto III, and the recently consecrated Sylvester II convened to adjudicate Arduin, who appeared in person to mount his defense, interestingly enough. In his submission, he acknowledged having led the individuals responsible for Peter's assassination, observed the deed, and subsequently maintained associations with them. The synod adjudged him culpable of episcopicide, construing the offense as equivalent to covert murder, notwithstanding the mitigating factor of voluntary public confession. These people cared about their own words, proclaiming him a public enemy and ordaining confiscations that, through diplomas issued in May, substantially augmented the holdings of Vercelli, inclusive of perpetual entitlement to the city and its surrounding country. It is probable that Leo himself authored the epitaph for Peter that escalated the allegations to include dismemberment and roasting of the remains. In the interval from 1002 to 1001, supplementary imperial benefactions directed toward the dioceses of Vercelli, Ivrea, and Novara effectively, at least nominally, eroded the structural unity of the Mark of Ivrea. The successors to Peter, Raginfrid, who received only a routine confirmation in December 997, and thereafter Adalbert abandoned aggressive patrimonial recuperation, thereby permitting Arduin to consolidate his regional authority without facing immediate reprisal, possibly owing to delayed imperial awareness of the full circumstances or the lingering influence of his partisans at court. Arduin strategically withdrew into the sheltered valleys of the Canaves, preserving a core of loyalty. His son Ardecinus narrowly escaped a nocturnal imperial summons to the palace at Pavia. That's also how out there he was. Again, this knight's, youthful, errant, and quite nobly bloated and sort of provocative against the center of imperial public authority, giving rise to even unsubstantiated rumors of a brief inheritance of the mark, while the attendance of Brother Wibert at Otto III's placitum in Milan during October 1001 suggested some erosion of partisan cohesion. Although the Bishop of Asti, Peter, I made a video about medieval Asti if you're interested, who see alone among original dioceses had enjoyed districtus privileges since 962, so it was part of the bishop counts mechanism, because that was also the year, by the way, when Otto I descended into Italy, incurred papal censure towards the end of 1000 for his unwavering allegiance to Arduin. That is interesting, because I made even a video alone about Asti and Aquileia, explaining how early on, like we just observed, as soon as the Ottonians arrived in Italy, they received incredibly powerful concessions by the emperor, and their privileges brought them to be incredibly strong ecclesiastical polis. But in this case, right, you have one of those very bishops counts that actually supports the Margrave. I say the Markian because in theory, like, that's how we should call him. But in any case, the picture is interesting because there's this setback ordained by the emperor and executed by the papacy that sort of brings things to a stall for Arduin's rise to power. But there are people that eventually side with him, even in sort of broader national sense, like saying, look, what will this mechanism go like? Would it be so bad under Arduin as opposed to at this point Otto III had problems and he wouldn't have much to leave because if you know the years. But it's really meaningful how, in fact, there was a potential to spring forth. We don't even know exactly whether, for example, his son was, as it was hypothesized, again, conferred by the emperor, probably the Mark of Ivrea, while his father was still alive, or his brother had gone over to Milan to the same ruler for sort of out just of representatives for the same Arduin, which would have been also a thing, or on his own account to gain something from his brother given his punishment. But this is exactly the turning point, because the abrupt death of Otto III in January 1002 precipitated a dramatic reversal in Arduin's fortunes. Right, the death of the emperor, also in Germany, everywhere, changed an enormous deal. This was probably the line of Saxony going extinct, right? And scarcely 22 days after the emperor's death, on February 15th, an assembly comprising magnates and knights gathered in Pavia. This was essentially the Italic council, right, parliament, so to say, acclaiming the same Arduin king within the Basilica of St. Michael Major, which is a beautiful church, even though the facade was rebuilt. There's really few from Arduin's times. That's mostly a 12th century facade, but it still gives you more or less an idea of this stern, robust, courageous, like Lombard style and aesthetic. Here, Arduin was hailed by the Italic nobility as Caesar, by the way, and accompanying his subsequent progress through the kingdom, initially with the Archbishop of Milan, Arnulf, prominently at his side, amid the disarray surrounding the imperial succession. This tells you also, as we were just saying, how feeble the imperial support really was to an extent, even among the same clergy. That naturally was very tactical about this all in many ways, but again, you can't simply say, as we said also for the Bishop of Asti, that whoever was a bishop count, or here the Archbishop of Milan, one of the single most powerful people in Europe, would necessarily side with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was no more. Interestingly enough, this made Arduin the first non-German ruler on the Italian throne in over 4 decades, representing a significant assertion of local noble autonomy against Ottonian imperial control. The Ottonians had been quite effective in Italy, right? We often talk about how their power was limited and virtual to some extent, but they had really invaded the peninsula. They had really come with their sort of bloodthirsty Saxons. They had managed to impose themselves. It was a clamorous enterprise. It's the reason why historiographically we sort of start talking of the Holy Roman Empire. The empire had always existed, also in the previous generations. But even from an Italic perspective, this was also a nuisance, right, of some kind. It was like, why shouldn't we rule ourselves? Arduin's elevation drew sustenance from the lesser nobility, that saw his guy politically rising to fulfill those promises made to them. Relatives within the Obertenghi clan, who harbored ambitions for the unassigned Mark of Tuscia following the death of Hugh II in December 1001, because Otto III had not wanted to make them succeed there, because these northwestern clans then would have become even more powerful and could have further united with the Ivrean domain. So, it was as a no. You have bishops such as Peter of Como, and Como is just in the far north of Milan, and that's from the Valtellina. So from essentially the wave to descend to Italy from Swabia, that will be in fact a very important highway for Frederick Barbarossa as well. There was also the Brenner Pass in northeastern Italy, bordering the same Lombardy, but that was an incredibly strategic town and episcopate. It was an actual civitas, but very boldly sort of signing with Arduin at the border with Germany. Peter of Como was possibly a son of the Count of Lomello. Cunibert, the same bishop of Asti, sided with Arduin. In addition to numerous monastic institutions, this had historically been more tied to the lay nobility through patrimonial funding. Many daughters, second sons, etc., had become abbots, abbesses of these institutions, including, for example, the San Salvatore in Pavia, originally founded by Adelaide, the female San Salvatore in Lucca, governed by the abbess Adelperga, St. Pontianus, with its abbot Ambrose linked to the pro-Lucchese judge Leo that we mentioned before. So it's like, everything was collapsing for imperial side. Vinizzo at the Amiata mountain, entangled in parallel disputes, and the Abbey of Nonantola. These were very big monastic foundations in the Italic kingdom, right? They were, like, if you had these from your side, you were very, very powerful. Further perspective allies encompass figures like Andrew of Lodi, Regenfrid of Bergamo, Tenno of Tortona, Varinos of Modena, and John of Vado Savona, in marked contrast to the absence of Genoa, while Lucca functioned as a crucial bridgehead into the hostile Tuscia until the eventual Pisan victory around 1003 or 1004. Naturally, there were lots of noblemen, monasteries, etc., that were not with Arduin, right? A lot of bishops also stuck to the pro-imperial stance. If anything, the problem was the extension of Arduin's domains. I mean, for how incredibly powerful he was essentially he ruled a provincial dimension, one increasingly like heading towards a regional one, at least ambitiously speaking. It's like saying, I don't know, this is a stem duchy in Germany by size, right? So fighting against imperial, another royal authority, it's something complicated, but there are also the Alps in between, and there is this great enthusiasm at Arduin's election. The earliest diplomas issued under his royal authority ratified long-standing immunities, facilitated free abbatial elections, secured closed transit routes from Como, affirmed governance over Chiavenna. That was another frontier area, the saying goes, for the allocation of to this as a segment of the Bellinzona castle, granted revenues from the auriferous sense of the Adda to Lodi for the territories of Cavenago and Galgagnano, yet simultaneously encouraged the subdivision of comital jurisdictions by bestowing favors upon loyalists, most conspicuously through the expansion of Desana holdings for the long-time confederate Cunibert, encroaching upon Vercelli's domain to a radius of 1 mile, and analogous endowments to the Diacon Theodebert of Ivrea. This is fascinating because you have a further backing of monastic power. There is here a territorial sheltering. The Po Valley here is sort of fortified, like there are some frontier areas that are consolidated, at least in political control. There is also the parcelization of some too powerful and in any case enemy noblemen, their assets, their estates to Arduin's faithful knights, right? So he rewarded all those secundi milites in his retinues and clienteles that had backed him in all these struggles, sword in hand. The Bishop of Como discharged duties as Arch-Chancellor, no fewer than 9 diplomas extending through January 1005. Silver denarii minted in Pavia bore close resemblance to those of Otto III, notably employing a rounded minuscule D within monograms to proclaim royal authority or divine grace, coupled with laudatory references to the civic glory of Pavia. I have this purely random occurrence, a video of Indo-European theology talking about the letter D that has most obviously to do with God. Now, resistance to Arduin somewhere in Italy had to arise anyway, and it rapidly crystallized around Tedald of Canossa, the Archbishop Frederick of Ravenna, bishops of Verona, Modena, the St. Peter III of Novara, because those had remained there, like backed by the emperor rather than by the papacy, Siegfried of Parma, related to Tedald, and above all, the implacable Leo Vercelli, with Warmund of Ivrea potentially experiencing a temporary displacement by an appointee named Ottobian. Positions of ambivalence included that of Arnulf of Milan upon his return from escorting Otto's prospective Byzantine bride Zoe to Bari, because that also should have been done. Alderic of Cremona, who exhibited sympathies until his death in 1004, succeeded by Henry's appointee Landulf. Siegfried of Piacenza, Guido of Pavia, notwithstanding his involvement in the coronation proceedings and the stance at Brescia as conveyed by Adalbold, while Como remained firmly aligned with Arduin. The Central Eastern Po plain and regions beyond the Apennines largely evaded his effective control. It's what we just said about Arduin's essentially Ivrean estates and broader domain projected mostly across like the western and the central Po Valley. On the latter, it was strong, but also because it was just under his sort of direct push and because of the imperial power vacuum. Canossa, Cremona, this was, as you know, also with the later probably local dynasty, one of the single most strategically relevant and also militarily powerful seigneuries. in Europe at large. They controlled the crucial Apennine passes towards Rome. The Eastern Po Valley was just like saying, okay, that had been historically a sea of sort of another rival, Friulan, Italic competitor house. The rest of Italy at large was just looking at this and saying, let's see where it goes. Because there is an immediate German response, right? So much so because Italy was of cardinal relevance. Without Italy, there could not be imperial title. For the Germans, there couldn't be an outlet in the Mediterranean. There was no possibility to carry out an ecumenic policy. So who succeeded Otto III? His uncle, Henry II, who was crowned German king in June 1002 and directly challenged Arduin's legitimacy. An incursion led by Duke Otto of Carinthia late in 1002 encountered fortified resistance at the Veronese closes along the Adige, the H in German. That is interesting because I made a video last year about the closes, so-called closes, the locks, if you want. Since Lombard and even probably Roman times, right, there's all these alpine passes that are basically fortified. There is all an in-depth series of fortifications, and if properly manned, supported by a host, you can prevent, ideally, an enemy army from crossing the Alpine Arc, right? And Otto of Carinthia is just aligned with the Ottonians, more or less, and he tries the Etch Valley, the Adige Valley, but he's blocked by Arduin's supporters at Verona. That was also the major cornerstone for, that initial. Also, Barbarossa will have troubles at some point when the Veronese closes were locked. He had to literally change a route across the Po Valley to go a wholly different place, hundreds of kilometers away, to go back to Germany. It was a flanking maneuver through the Sugana Valley, proving unsuccessful for the Germans, culminating in a decisive engagement on the Brenta plain near Fabrica or Monte Ungarico during spring 1003 that routed the invaders. If you're interested in Tyrolean history, I made a video about that, so you see a bit also the geography there and how sort of important the local seigneuries were in this European game. Henry's personal descent into Italy would occur only in March 1004, arriving at Trento by April the 9th, rallying Tedald at Verona, the suffragans of Ravenna at Brescia, likely swaying Reginfrid of Bergamo and receiving Arnulf's welcome there. A diversionary force from the Piave River and Carinthia breached the defenses along the Adige and Brenta rivers, precipitating the disintegration of Arduin's army and widespread revolts without necessitating a pitched battle by the time of Easter. Encampment on the Vicenza plain between Bassano and Cittadella. This was an important defeat because essentially Arduin had to back down. He had been king for a couple of years, and there hadn't been much the Germans could do, but with a proper expedition, now the king of the Romans was in Italy, was crowned king of the realm in Pavia on May the 15th. However, also Henry's arrival was actually met with overt hostility. There was an immediate popular uprising the following day in the capital of the Italic kingdom, compelling the king's flight, with the deliberate razing of the city, by the way, evoking widespread shock throughout Italy and profoundly undermining residual support. This was a bad mistake. It's something that the Germans will repeat historically with Milan, with all these, again, very concentrated urban centers of power, the old sort of core of the Lombard kingdom, during the wars of the Lombard League and so on. So the Germans did not accept this in many ways and resorted to this indiscriminate massacres and destructions that basically alienated their support for it. Further again, it's sort of incorrect in a broader sense to make this a sort of national struggle per se, because there were, as we've seen here, different allegiances, mixed ancestry, sort of a general interaction between the two sides of the Alps, but it's difficult not to see, of course, definitely a contrast between a more sort of probably Eastern Frankish or Italic, if you don't want to say German and Italian, rivalry, competition, hostility, right? This again, all these rulers understood their power in very serious terms. Any kind of disagreement was immediately sort of thought to be addressed with a sword, right? And in many ways, it did make sense, but it also has a price. Also because indirectly the entire region is devastated. Politically speaking, this is shown by documentation in Po Valley, in Piedmont, abandoning reference, for example, to Arduin's regnal years from March onward, witnessing Cremona's realignment, the replacement of Como's bishop with a transalpine figure. So these were essentially Eastern Frankish appendices, while Asti persisted in fidelity, also because it was difficult and risky for the same Henry to venture further west, rising up the Po Valley. These are wide areas, and you would think it's a flat land, so it's easy. Absolutely not. There is a river at every city, fortified bridges. It's terrifying, and it actually blocks a great deal of maneuvering. This is something that we find up until even properly like the wars of Italian unification, with large-scale warfare maneuver were carried out in the Po Valley. That it's a bit of a logistical and strategic nightmare, right? If you don't own, of course, like the guys on the other side, because otherwise, when these places align, with, as it's to be shown, I have a series incoming on the Lombard League wars. There, it's even more of a problem for those who are infiltrating. So at this point, there is something similar. Imagine, in any case, a pretty sound fortification. Again, Italy had been one of the first countries to properly spread encastellation from the area of Rome since the mid-10th century. We have this very heavy, also very often stone built, also thanks to the older Roman infrastructure that could provide with means of material properly extracted from the ancient buildings, that the Baltic will not see until 200 years later. And so also for the Eastern Franks operating in this reality, especially with a staunch resistance, was something very increasingly complicated, because the cities were becoming ever more autonomously minded and rich and powerful. So even in a couple of generations, paradoxically, same autonomy and stability, the landscape had definitely sort of complicated itself for anyone wanting to directly control these places. Retreating to fortified refuges in the Orco Valley, notably the fortified Holy Cross at Sparone in Locana, Arduin withstood prolonged sieges. In fact, he could exploit the defensive, enduring through the winter of 1004-5, only yielding to harsh conditions that facilitated eventual withdrawal, thereby enabling gradual recuperation of northwestern territories, supported by a mobile chancery capable of issuing a further 10 diplomas alongside continued coinage. This is very interesting, by the way, because it shows how even like Arduin had properly a royal milieu, bureaucracy, and he could, of course, hope that even by entrenching himself in his castles, this is what the Longobards had historically done against the Franks in general, for Transalpine invaders that were more powerful than them. Shut yourself in inside these cities, these castles, and those guys have their logistical bases north of the Alps. If they have, especially just to come back, there's not much they can do unless they want to conquer the place. It took Charlemagne 9 months of siege before Pavia was captured, which was exceptional. It was the longest siege of the Carolingian era. This tells you, again, by scale, even how infrastructurally well served the Po Valley was. Together with northern France, was really the most developed part in Europe. Alderic Manfred II, Margrave of Turin, adopted a posture of studied neutrality, thereby indirectly sustaining the loyalty of Asti's bishop Peter even after the imposition of his brother Alric in 1008, accomplished without Arnulf's consent, prompting Peter's refusal, effective refusal, direct papal consecration between May and June, igniting Arnulf's military campaign against Asti, persisting until a penitential submission in Milan between October 1008 and April 1009, that preserved Alric's position without effecting any genuine reconciliation with the archbishop, though. So it's a very complicated situation. You understand how many counties and dioceses, and sometimes the same thing because of the bishop counts, existed at close distance from probably the heartland of Arduin's domain. This was completely normal for the time. This was not just an Italian characteristic. It's really about post-Coronation Europe. Sparse surviving records additionally document personal military engagements by Arduin in the Novara area alongside the counts of Pombia, raids in the pre-Alpine zones between Como and Milan, conducted by the sons of the deceased Siegfried, Hugh, and Berengar, who maintained Obertenghi alliances through matrimonial ties involving Railenda and Riprand II, a fleeting adherence from Jerome of Vicenza until his deprivation in early 1013 upon shifting allegiance to Henry in favor of Theodald, and conjectural occupation even of Pavia at some point, inferred from a 17th century copy at least attesting Arduin's consent to a donation by his son Otto to the diocese under the new bishop Reinald. Just think about how many documents were lost at some point. I made an entire video about the Rerum Italicarum Scriptores, about the history of medieval historiography. And we get sometimes, again, just this later modern era copies of important documents that were lost maybe at the same time because they were sort of not preserved with the adequate care because they had the copies. But we are very limited in in-depth reconstruction. You understand how much military activity, however, was going on under Arduin, trying to keep this system, this shatter system together. However, this is interesting because there are years before a further descent of Henry where Arduin is still maintaining power. As King of Italy, by the way, that he doesn't give up. Henry's subsequent Italian campaign of 1013-1014, undertaken after resolving Polish affairs, and I talk about German-Polish warfare too in a video. We looked at that campaign there, culminated in Henry's final imperial coronation in Rome by Benedict VIII in February. That, at that point, truly broke the reins of Arduinic sympathizers in Rome, at least, inflicting severe setbacks upon the same Obertenghi through imprisonments across the Alps and the establishment of a new diocese at Bobbio, naturally under Imperial, who carved from the abbatial cord that critically undermined their patrimonial integrity as well. Operations in 1014 encompassed the siege of Novara, the capture of Vercelli with Leo's expulsion. These were carried out by Arduin, though advances towards Como ultimately faltered, right? He thought that by seizing Como would have yielded Milan as well. Overwhelmed by advancing illness and profound exhaustion, I mean, these men spent their entire life on horseback, literally. Just think about the constant pressure all across. Arduin elected to abdicate, deposing the Italic royal crown upon the altar of Frutuaria, the Benedictine abbey near St. Benignus in the Canaves, that Arduin had lavishly endowed in a penultimate authentic diploma of January 1005 under the guidance of the reformer William of Volpiano. We talked about him in the videos about the Gregorian reforms because those were basically the times this insistence in imperial control of the church would paradoxically bring the church to adopt the same rhetoric of necessary ecclesiastical purification that will eventually lead to papal monarchy. So you understand how beautiful history is, that you can't connect all these generations, all these figures, all these dynamics. The William of Vulpiano was, by the way, potentially even a kinsman of Arduin of Ivrea through a sister named Perinzia. The Abbey of Frutuaria had been originally conceived as a dynastic mausoleum, albeit subject to later contestation, right, to the Ivrean house, right? Imagine even the sort of the metaphysical beliefs. Here we will try to sort of wrap it up in a deeper sense. Like, do you realize what extraordinary force it took to handle this, and the act probably of restoring this imperium, like to at least abdicate, to say I've done my best, I've done what I could, right? And embracing monastic seclusion in a state depleted by relentless toil and malady, Arduin passed away on December the 14th, 1051, according to the abbey's necrological records, and was interred before the high altar. In the aftermath, his remaining adherents, bolstered by contingent assistance from Olderic, managed to seize Ivrea in 1016 and expel its bishop, that, as we've seen, was sort of an enemy of his. It had been backed by Imperials, yet the mark, as a cohesive entity that had lasted for centuries since Carolingian times, irrevocably dissolved amid the autonomous aspirations of Vercelli and Novara, with the weakened diocese of Ivrea further obstructed by the interventions of Arduin's own descendants that kept the struggle going on. And their story is perhaps for another video, as ideally everything that we really cover. So this is really extraordinary in so many ways, because you understand how the backdrop of all this, what was going on with both the empire, the papacy, the communal phenomenon is still fairly distant. It will take multiple generations before the first consular regimes will be instituted, but you realize already how these old feudal powers are basically dissolving. The emperors can barely control the Italic kingdom. There is this strong resistance against them. There is a display of brutality. The papacy is basically swinging, depending on sort of still, at this point, it had always been backed by the empire and as much as controlled by it. So it was a sort of Stockholm syndrome, as well as, a reason of opportunism. Sylvester II, surviving to Otto III, represented a bit like the success of the Church, of a truly ecumenic breadth of the Church of Rome that was now starting to think to intervene also in northern Italian affairs, the same ones of the Italic crown. We've seen it with Erlenbald, with the Patery, and in the following decades, really, to obstacle the imperial episcopal appointees in favor, in fact, of a local military policy, siding with knights that were in part even backed by heterodox movements. Essentially, the early pauperistic evangelic ones were reactivating a climate of increased ideological debate regarding the role of the empire, the papacy. The papacy sort of even backed what would later become, at this point it was not fully fledged, but later the same Cathars will spring as the more radical fringes of this. And the papacy initially, so in order to secure its power that eventually will succeed to crush the Cathars, that is sort of underrated and speaks volumes of how far-sighted really the papacy was historically. He understood, like later in the wars of the Lombard League, that a free papacy could operate with a much broader reach in Christendom, and a direct control of Rome from the side of the emperor would have undermined any hope of autonomy. Right, so under Arduin, that is a defeated of history, but still one that, if anything, probably was more amazed by, stunned, just like Henry, by the dissolution of sort of other robust feudal entities across Italy and the emergence, de facto, of cities as the true centers of power, not these seigneurial domains of noblemen, were still very powerful, but would eventually urbanize themselves. We've seen that there were monasteries also in these cities and so on from their lineages. So it's a world deeply changing, deeply creating. Again, in the video about Florence in the 11th century, we see the Tuscan situation pretty well, right? And how the rural noble lineages, even though, again, they lived in the city in part, became ever more threatened by the creation of the commune. Paradoxically, the Florentine one was delayed. It emerged at the beginning of the 12th century after the death of Matilda of Canossa, because paradoxically she favored that communal development, but as a greater ruler against those lineages. Tuscany was slightly different from northern Italy, that were historically more powerful lineages. And also the same communes would never, for example, be ruled by the people, like many Tuscan communes will at some point. There is always properly the archbishop, there is the nobility, and then there is the people, right? It's more a condition of power sharing. Milan is immense in any case. It's growing fast at this point, becoming really the new center of so many things in a truly urban dimension, right? Naturally, again, I like these kind of videos because they tell you how everything actually worked at the time. Here we could depart making many other considerations for different regional sort of outcomes, also the papacy, the empire, but it's important to see how the Italic kingdom worked, because Arduin of Ivrea was not just the last native king of Italy in the Middle Ages, so to say, but also the German emperors had to realize that controlling directly the Italian kingdom was a much greater problem than it seemed, right? You have great rulers like Conrad II that basically and paradoxically pursues a similar policy, trying to Arduin, at least in convincing, as we were saying before, with the Constitutio de Feudis, the Dictum de Beneficiis, that will spread from the Italic capitulary to the rest of Europe, as a matter of fact. We're telling you how important what was happening constitutionally and institutionally in Italy was for the rest of the West. To win over, in fact, those the sub-vassals, right? So the bulk of the probably knights that in Lombardy in particular were many and were affluent. They were the ones who will actually go on creating the communes, the consular regime. So it's quite fascinating. But after that, you have these were essentially the Salians already, and but later Salians will basically get engulfed into major warfare also in northern Italy. When we talk about the investiture controversy, we mostly think just the relation between the papacy and the empire in some abstract sense, but there was a lot of warfare waged, and if anything, we have to cover that part better, right? You just think about the gang nach Canossa at Semilia, but everything was much more messed up than that. And you have, at the same time, paradoxically, an Italic identity that is reinforced throughout all this, because there is no further fragmentation in a national identity sense. There's actually an increasing compaction of this uniformity through the communal institutional development, because the Italian communes basically go on with the same type of reform, same stages of governmental development, even though there were like 30 different communes. They were very well coordinated, especially in Lombardy. This also for waging war against the Holy Roman Emperors that were just across the Alps, right? We're just bordering straight away. So I made many videos also about the various communal histories of these various cities, etc. But we'll have to make more about similar figures like Arduin, like the previous Italic kings of the 9th or the 10th century, and also talking a bit more about all these interactions with other countries as well. What, for example, the Magyar threat had represented, how it had dealt things in the same Italic kingdom. There's the Friulan monarchy. There's the Spolitan one. In part, we looked at Tuscia, which is also yet another sort of interesting player there. Plus these Transalpine interventions that are always fascinating. There's also the period before, well, there we are at the end of the 9th century, with the, Arnulf of Carinthia, later Ludwig the Child, and so on, Louis the Child, Charles the Bald from the other side. But it's really, we, if anything, made a video about Charles the Simple recently that is more like an increasingly Neustrian thing, as opposed to an imperial one. But when you look at history like Arduin's, you realize that there is this equally provincial scale that is, again, endowed with power, with capacity, and is not actually degrading into something like a failed state. It's paradoxical. This is an exception, by the way. Paradoxically strengthening through that sort of multi-urban kind of compaction that will generate some of their most striking civilizational outcomes in the Middle Ages and beyond, with essentially the communes, the city-states, the seigneuries, humanism, the Renaissance, etc. That, in a way, was continuing a bit the legacy of the old Italic kings. We've seen it, for example, in the video about Galeazzo. The Milanese at some point from these same areas, basically, here we're talking Ivrea, it's different, but it's fundamentally Milan. Everything was always ruled from Lombardy. It was the most powerful state. Will try, as you know, during the 14th century to recreate essentially an Italic kingdom. They thought probably, once again, the recognition of a higher title. Naturally, the situation in the Holy Roman Empire was very different at that point, but you see actually the same regional cradle sort of being revived for these states to affirm themselves differently. And interestingly enough, always remember the Kingdom of Italy lasted until the 19th century, which is also the same century in which United Italy, sort of few generations apart, was created in a different way, because it's not a direct continuation of the Italic kingdom. It's also bigger because it included the entire peninsula. But it was based on different presuppositions, but still, unified from the north. And so these are all things that can stimulate some reflection. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.